Russians, if the Red Army could take Berlin for the Western Allies, much of Central as well as Eastern Europe. For Adolf Hitler and his most fanatical followers, the last hope of salvation was that the Red Army would be defeated at the gates of the capital. In reality, the Nazis' last defiant gesture served only to trigger the most horrific battle ever fought in a city. In the flaming ruins of Berlin, hundreds of thousands of Russian and German lives were lost, and the seal was set on a victory that would divide the continent of Europe for decades to come. The beginning of the end for Hitler's Reich had come at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. There, a massive German armored offensive, culminating in the greatest tank battle of the war, was utterly broken by the Red Army. At Kursk, any prospect Germany began to take the initiative east back. The Soviet offensives of early 1944 had, in the north, driven the Germans back to the borders of Estonia. To the south, the Red Army had struck in the Ukraine and had destroyed the entire southern wing of the German armies. The next stage was to finish clearing the enemy from the rest of Soviet territory. The main thrust of the Russian summer offensive, codenamed Bagration, was against the German Army Group Center. The first blows fell on June the 22nd, and within 2 weeks, 3 Russian fronts had ripped through German lines, destroying 28 divisions and retaking Minsk. On July the 13th, 1st Ukrainian and 1st Belarusian fronts were thrown at Army Group North Ukraine. 2 weeks later, the Red Army reached the river Vistula. And on August the 1st, the Polish capital, Warsaw, exploded in an uprising. To the north, the front line was pushed almost as far as Riga. In 5 weeks, Germany had lost 350,000 men, a disaster greater than Stalingrad. With the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944, the situation most dreaded by the German High Command had become a reality. The Reich was doomed to a defensive war on 2 major fronts. Within 8 weeks, the Allies had broken out of their bridgeheads. The Wehrmacht bitterly contested every inch of ground, but the enemy dominated the skies. Another 8 weeks, and Paris had been liberated. In this second Battle of France, the German army had lost 750,000 men and vast quantities of equipment. On the Allied side, it seemed to many as if the end of the war could be in sight. By mid-September, American forward units had even set foot on German soil. In spite of the shattering blows it had suffered, the German Wehrmacht remained a force to be reckoned with. As the Allies had advanced, the lines of communication had lengthened, while those of the Germans had become shorter. As yet, the Allies had the use of only one major seaport, and were at the limits of their fuel and ammunition. Along the front, German resistance began to stiffen. And while the British and Americans argued over strategy, the Wehrmacht regrouped for a last-ditch offensive. The object was to split the Allied armies in 2 by attacking through southern Belgium and the forest of the Ardennes. by late December 1944, the front line in the west followed the course of the Ruhr, Our and Saar rivers. In southern Belgium, there was a shallow salient, a bulge in the line, facing Ardennes, hilly and in places heavily wooded region. It was through this area that Hitler had launched his most deadly thrust into France in 1940. For the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans had mustered the 6th SS and 5th Panzer Armies and the 7th Army. Facing them were elements of the American 1st and 9th Armies, flanked by the 3rd. On the 16th of December, the Germans attacked. In the north, 6th Panzer Army's progress was slow, but a spearhead broke through and charged headlong for the Meuse. 5th Panzer shattered the first inexperienced American divisions it encountered, and by the 18th was fast approaching Bastogne, a vital road and rail junction. Although poor weather had, as the Germans expected, grounded Allied air forces, the offensive was already behind schedule. Wintry conditions and blown bridges were slowing the advance, and all German units were suffering from a desperate shortage of fuel. 5th Panzer had quickly surrounded Bastogne, but the Americans in the town refused to surrender, and by now, the Allies were recovering from the shock of the onslaught. By December the 24th, 1st and 9th Armies, backed by the British 30th Corps, had rallied and blocked any further German advance towards the Meuse. The US 3rd Army now turned 90 degrees and attacked the German flank from the south. On December the 26th, Bastogne was relieved, and with the weather clearing, the Allies unleashed their overwhelming air power. Within 3 weeks of the relief of Bastogne, the Germans had been forced back to their start positions. Hitler had refused to sanction a timely withdrawal, and the delay had cost the Wehrmacht most of their losses, in all 100,000 men and 600 precious tanks. For the German armed forces, the Battle of the Bulge had been a catastrophe. For months, the Western Front had been allocated the bulk of German production of tanks and heavy weapons. Vast numbers had now been expended to no avail. Meanwhile, in the east, the Wehrmacht had been starved of resources. This at a time when the Red Army was stronger and more ably led than at any period in its history. At the beginning of September 1944, 5 German army groups in the east had faced 11 fronts of the Red Army, along a line more than 1,200 miles long. By mid-October, a Soviet drive to clear the Baltic states had left most of Army Group North cut off in the Courland Peninsula, where 20 infantry and 2 armored divisions would remain trapped until the end of the war. To the south, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts had pushed into Romania and Hungary, and by late December had captured Belgrade and encircled the Hungarian capital, Budapest. There, another 188,000 Axis troops were cut off. By the close of 1944, the Red Army had expelled the Germans from Soviet territory and had broken the back of the Wehrmacht. One by one, Germany's Axis allies had fallen by the wayside, and although fighting still raged around Budapest, all along the central and northern sectors of the front, Soviet forces had already begun a careful redeployment for the next major offensive. Planned for January 1945, this would be the final, all-out assault that would take the Red Army into the very heart of Hitler's Reich. To Joseph Stalin, Berlin was the prize. Soviet enemy should cross the river and break through to threaten the German capital. They were to be stopped and crushed at the gates of Berlin itself. On its perimeter, the city was guarded by its own fortified defense line. Inside were yet more lines, dividing the capital into independent self-defending sectors, many crisscrossed by waterways. Berlin's massive concrete flak towers were also formidable. Their guns could be trained to fire down into the streets. The will to fight was, the Nazi leadership believed, the key to survival for the shattered remnants of the Third Reich. The population, military and civilian, must be made to believe that in defeat they would be given no quarter. For most, there was little difficulty imagining the fate that would befall them at the hands of vengeful Russians. But the West, too, had added fuel to the fire of German resolve. Almost ceaseless bombing of the Reich cities had already left many in ruins, and in the summer of 1944, an Allied plan had been discussed which seemed to promise no mercy to the German people. Germany would be divided permanently. Huge swathes of territory were to be given to the Soviet Union, Poland, France and Denmark. All her surviving heavy industry was to be dismantled, and Germany was to be returned to a medieval state of small farmers and a subsistence economy. The plan was supported by Roosevelt, but strongly opposed by Churchill, and was soon dropped. However, for Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, it was priceless material. To the citizens of the Reich, and especially to the inhabitants of its capital, who had suffered so much from Allied bombing, it was yet more proof that the only hope was determined resistance to the very end. By 1944, Marshal Georgy Zhukov had already proved himself the greatest and most aggressive commander in the Red Army. Zhukov was Stalin's favorite general and a popular military hero. He was brilliant, ruthless, and had never once been defeated in battle. Zhukov had successfully defended Leningrad, and at the Battle of Stalingrad had encircled and captured the entire German Sixth Army. Zhukov had also played an important part in the great Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk. Since August 1942, Zhukov had been Deputy Supreme Commander of all Soviet forces, second only to Stalin. He had directed the huge Russian drive across the Ukraine, and as commander of the First Ukrainian Front, had advanced at an astonishing 30 miles a day in early 1944. In June, he took overall command of the Red Army fronts and orchestrated Russia's greatest military achievement of the war so far, the Discretion offensive and the rout of the German Army Group Center. Zhukov's very success now threatened to make him an object of suspicion to Stalin, a situation usually attended with fatal consequences. However, as the finest commander in the history of the Red Army, even the Soviet dictator could not afford to move against him, and in November 1944, Stalin let it be understood that Zhukov's forces should be the ones to attack and capture the Nazi capital. Only on the eve of the attack would Zhukov learn that with Stalin, nothing was certain. Although Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner was an able soldier, he was also one of the most fervent Nazis ever to command a German army. Schörner would follow Hitler's most unrealistic orders to the letter, often with disastrous results. Schörner had been made chief of the National Socialist Leadership Corps in early 1944, and in June was in command of Army Group North during the Soviet summer offensive. With his army, Schörner was trapped on the Courland Peninsula, helpless for 6 months, until in January 1945, he was evacuated to command Army Group Center. During the final Russian attack, far from reflecting the truth of the desperate predicament in which his forces found themselves, Schörner constantly fed Hitler's delusions with promises of victory. On the eve of the last battle, Schörner would be rewarded for his slavishness. Hitler would make him a field marshal and the last commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht. During 1944, the Red Army had launched no fewer than 10 major offensives, and as the year had gone on, its performance in the field had improved beyond all recognition. The Russian ability to conduct massive battles of encirclement at speed now equaled or even surpassed the expertise of the German army at the height of its powers early in the war. The Red Air Force had also evolved into a supremely proficient service, excelling particularly in tactical operations. Its effectiveness had been radically improved by decentralizing its command structure, so that Soviet air power could respond quickly and flexibly to requests for support from the ground forces. By now, all arms of the Soviet military machine were lavishly equipped with advanced weapons. Russian industrial production, free from the disruptive effects of enemy bombing and able to call on vast reserves of labor and strategic materials, could easily replace the Red Army's losses. At the start of 1945, the strength of Soviet forces in the field was over 6 million men, 15,000 combat aircraft, 100,000 artillery pieces, and 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. In 1943, the T-34, once the finest tank on the battlefield, began to lose its edge against greatly improved German tank designs. In particular, the T-34's 76mm gun was no longer effective against the heavy armor of the latest Panzers. The answer was to upgun the T-34 to an 85mm weapon. The new gun demanded a new turret, and the resulting design was an efficient 3-man unit. Crew capacity went up from 4 to 5, meaning that the tank commander could concentrate on tactics and leave the gunnery to a specialist. Additional improvements included a new 5-speed gearbox and increased armour thickness to 110 millimetres on the front and 90 millimetres on the turret. The new tank was a formidable weapon. Together with its parent, the T-34-76, the 85 would play a central role in the coming Soviet offensive. Introduced in February 1944, the Stalin II had been designed to counter the formidable German Panthers and Tigers. Although by German standards a medium tank, the Stalin was very heavily armoured and mounted an enormous 122mm gun. In its ability to penetrate armour at medium ranges, the Stalin's gun was in fact little better than the German 75 or 88, and the tank could carry far less ammunition, only 28 rounds. However, when firing high explosive shells against soft targets, the Stalin was extremely effective. In the Berlin street fighting, the Stalin would prove itself all but indestructible. The Ilyushin II Stormovik ground attack aircraft was first introduced in mid-1941 and would go on in single and two-seat versions to become the most numerous aircraft in the Red Air Force and in the history of aviation. Believed by Joseph Stalin to be the single most important weapon possessed by the Soviet Union, the Stormovik came to symbolize the resurgence of Russian power after the setbacks of 1941. The Stormovik's capabilities in the ground attack role were due, above all, to its heavy armour protection. It had a continuous backbone of 7mm armour plate that protected the cockpit, radiators, engine and fuel tanks. The Stormovik could survive anti-aircraft barrages lethal to any other warplane. The Stormovik's engine delivered its maximum power at low altitudes. Armed with rockets, bombs, cannon and machine guns, the Stormovik would play a leading part in the destruction of German armour and lines of communication throughout the final offensive. Or Little Kate multiple rocket launcher had been developed in the late 1930s and was first used in action in July 1941. Because of the peculiar sound it made on launching, the weapon was named Stalin's organ by German troops. By 1945, the Katyusha fired 132mm fin-stabilized rockets with 40-pound high-explosive warheads to a distance of 9,250 yards. The weapons could be mounted on 2.5-ton trucks, which had their cabs protected by steel blast deflectors, or in freestanding launchers, able to fire up to 48 rockets in a volley. To the German infantrymen, the Katyusha was the most feared weapon in the Soviet arsenal. And although the rockets were none too accurate, a Katyusha barrage could lay waste a vast area of the battlefield, destroying everything in its path. Since the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army had changed out of all recognition. Stalin had moved to curb the power of the detested political commissars, and a new generation of competent and dedicated officers and NCOs had risen on their merits to displace party loyalists. As for the private soldier, even the German enemy had been forced to recognize the men of the Red Army were not only courageous in battle, but also well-trained and extremely tough. Many infantrymen had walked the 1,000 miles from Stalingrad to the Vistula, while home leave was practically unheard of. For Red Army soldier, discipline was harsh and unrelenting. Stalin had said that it took a brave man to be a coward in the Red Army, and tens of thousands had been shot for desertion at Stalingrad alone. It was equally perilous to be incompetent or just plain unlucky, and rank offered no protection. During the course of the war, 238 generals and admirals would be shot or would die in penal battalions for failing to deliver the expected results. For commanders living with such a threat, the lives of ordinary soldiers were of little account, and there was an indifference to casualties that shocked even the Wehrmacht. The Red Army's offensive tactics reflected the value it placed on the lives of infantrymen. Major attacks were often launched not with elite guards armies, but by shock armies of infantry who would be thrown at the defences in vast numbers to create gaps which the elite units would then exploit. Often the shock armies themselves spearheaded penal battalions, units made up of men who had committed military or civil crimes. The missions were usually suicidal and could involve clearing minefields by marching across them in formation at gunpoint. By the end of 1944, the German army was a shadow of the awesome machine that 5 years earlier had unleashed blitzkrieg on an unsuspecting world. In the east, it could still field more than 3 million men, but appalling losses had severely reduced the quality of its fighting formations. At Hitler's insistence, understrength divisions that should have been merged were retained as independent entities, carrying a heavy burden of administration and logistical support. German industry, in spite of increasing output of war material to the highest level ever, was failing to keep with the enemy's production or with German losses, particularly in tanks and aircraft. Panzer Division now had a theoretical strength of only 120 tanks, little more than a third its 1939 complement. In reality, many had less than 60, and the German army was increasingly relying on cheaper, less effective, self-propelled guns. In the air, the Luftwaffe, exhausted from its desperate attempts to stem the tide of Allied air power, had already passed the point of no return. Aircraft production had reached the amazing figure of 40,000 in 1944, but even such a feat could not redress the balance. The Luftwaffe could still field fewer combat aircraft than it could in 1940. And to compound its difficulties, there was also a major fuel crisis. Allied bombers had systematically hammered the German oil industry, and in the coming months, fuel would become the constant preoccupation of every German commander of air or ground forces. By late 1944, the Mark V Panther made up around half the strength of German armored divisions on the Eastern Front. The best medium tank deployed by any army in World War II, the Panther G incorporated any modifications suggested by tank crews in the field. In particular, the Panther's side armor had been increased in thickness, and the reliability of the tank's drivetrain had been greatly improved. Like early models, the Panther G was armed with a supremely well-designed, long-barreled 75mm gun, capable of penetrating 120mm sloped armor at over 1,000 yards.